The arena of Vrix Prime pulsed with life, the Colosseum stretching high into the sky, its jagged metallic edges gleaming under the neon glow of 1,000 artificial suns. Thousands of voices belonging to species from every corner of the galaxy rose in a cacophony of roars, chants, and howls. They were here for a fight, a spectacle, a warrior's reckoning. And at the center of it all, standing like a titan of war, was Kalara of the Nihal Dominion. She was a beast of a woman, her physique carved by years of brutal combat, her presence alone enough to make the weaker species shrink away. Standing at nearly 7 feet tall, her muscles coiled beneath battle-scarred armor, her skin a deep onyx with violet tribal markings that glowed faintly under the arena lights. She wielded 2 blades, each as long as a man's arm, their serrated edges pulsing with energy that sang for blood. Tonight, however, she was not here for the routine slaughter of lesser opponents. No, this fight was personal. Her golden eyes scanned the crowd until they found him. Jack Carter, a human, a soldier, a nobody who had somehow earned her notice in the war zones of Tarsus Physix, where he had cut down Nihal warriors like he had been born for it. He had killed her kin, not out of malice, but because it was his duty. And in doing so, he had done something no human had done before. He had earned the interest of Kalara. She raised her blade and pointed it directly at him. "I challenge you, human." Her voice boomed through the arena, drowning out the deafening crowd. "Stand against me in battle, and should you triumph." A smirk curled on her lips, something dark, primal, and laced with danger. "Then by the laws of my people, I will be yours." The roar of the crowd became thunder, waves of excitement crashing over them. The Nihal were warriors, and their traditions were absolute. In their culture, the strongest ruled, and if a warrior was defeated in open combat, they belonged to their conqueror. Jack Carter narrowed his eyes from the challenger's pit, his arms crossed over his battle-worn armor. He had fought battles across dozens of systems, faced horrors beyond nightmares. But this was new. He had expected to fight for his life. He had not expected to fight for someone else's. Jack Carter had seen countless battlefields, but never had he stood in a place quite like Vrix Prime's grand arena. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. Rows upon rows of spectators, their alien features illuminated by flashing screens that displayed his face alongside Kalara's. The betting odds were against him, favoring the monstrous Nihal warrior by a staggering margin. And Jack? He wasn't even sure he wanted to win. Not like this. His fingers flexed over the hilt of his combat knife, the weight of it familiar. His other weapons had been taken away for the duel. This would be a battle of skill, strength, and willpower. And across the field, Kalara was watching him like a predator, her golden eyes gleaming with something dangerous. He stepped forward, stopping just at the edge of the designated battle zone. The metal beneath his boots vibrated with the energy of the force fields that kept the combatants contained within the ring. He met her gaze. "You're serious about this?" Kalara smirked, rolling her shoulders, her armor shifting with the movement. "Nihal warriors do not speak empty words." Jack exhaled, his jaw tightening. "And what happens if I refuse?" The crowd booed at the mere suggestion. Kalara's expression darkened. "You cannot refuse, human. The challenge was made before the lords of the arena. Denial would mean cowardice, and your species would be branded as weak." She tilted her head, studying him. "And you, Jack Carter, are not weak." The words carried weight, more than he wanted to admit. Jack clenched his fists. This wasn't a simple fight. This was ritual, tradition, something sacred to them. To her. And Kalara was not the kind of woman who would throw her fate to the wind without reason. He had seen her type before, the kind of warrior who thrived in battle, who needed the challenge like air in their lungs. But there was something more to her challenge, something unspoken in the way she watched him, as if she were testing him before the fight had even begun. Jack's breath came slow and measured. The moment he accepted, he would have to give everything, and if he won, his prize would be something he wasn't sure he was prepared for. Still, backing down was not an option. With one last glance at the roaring crowd, he stepped forward into the ring. "I accept your challenge," he said, voice steady. Kalara's smirk widened into something savage. "Good." The war drum sounded. The battle had begun. The arena trembled as the force fields activated, sealing Jack Carter and Kalara inside the battle zone. The energy shimmered in a translucent dome around them, ensuring that neither could escape and that their fight would have no interference. The crowd roared with uncontained fervor, the excitement of witnessing a battle between an eighth Nihal warrior and a human soldier driving them into a frenzy. Jack exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening, body relaxing into the stance that had kept him alive through dozens of conflicts. He had fought before, killed before. But this wasn't a battlefield. There were no squads watching his flank, no mission objectives, no fallback plan. It was just him and her. Kalara rolled her shoulders, her dual blades gleaming under the artificial light, her stance that of a warrior honed by centuries of combat. She was massive, but she moved with predatory grace, her muscles fluid beneath her dark armor. She grinned at him, sharp teeth flashing. "Last chance to run, human." Jack smirked, his fingers flexing around the hilt of his combat knife. "And let you gloat about it for the rest of your life? No chance." The war drums pounded. The fight had begun. Kalara moved first, a blur of brutal speed that no creature of her size should have possessed. Her blades slashed toward him in a deadly arc, that designed to tear through flesh and bone with a single stroke. Jack dodged, his boots skidding over the sand-covered metal floor. He barely avoided the first attack before the second blade came whipping around, aiming for his ribs. He twisted, dropping to a crouch as the blade sliced just above his head, the sheer force of the swing cutting through the air like a hurricane. If he had been even a second slower, it would have cut him in half. She was fast. Faster than anything he had ever fought before. Jack rolled away, getting some distance, but Kalara was relentless. She charged after him, forcing him into constant motion, her strikes a series of rapid slashes, each one intended to either kill him outright or break him down piece by piece. Jack analyzed her movements, looking for openings. She favored power over defense. Her style was aggressive, unrelenting. She attacked in bursts, overwhelming her opponent until they either crumbled under the pressure or made a fatal mistake. Jack had no intention of doing either. He dodged another attack, feeling the heat of her blade passing inches from his skin. He kept his movements tight, minimal, conserving his energy while making her waste hers. Kalara growled, clearly frustrated by his evasiveness. "Fight me, human," she snapped, lunging forward with a vicious downward strike. Jack didn't run, he didn't dodge. Instead, he stepped into her attack. Kalara's eyes widened in surprise, but it was too late. Jack ducked under her arm, slamming his shoulder into her ribs as he slid past her. His combat knife lashed out in the same motion, slicing along the exposed part of her side, where her armor didn't fully cover. A flash of dark purple blood splattered onto the arena floor. The crowd screamed in shock. Jack rolled back to his feet, knife held ready. He wasn't foolish enough to think he had hurt her. He had tagged her, landed a hit, drawn first blood, but a wound like that wouldn't stop a Nihal warrior. If anything, it would only fuel her rage. Kalara turned slowly, golden eyes burning. She looked down at the wound on her side, then back at him. And then, she laughed. A deep, rich laugh that sent chills through the watching crowd. "You dare to wound me?" she growled, stepping toward him. "Good, then I don't have to hold back anymore." Jack barely had time to react before she was on him again. And this time, she wasn't playing. Jack had fought against overwhelming odds before. He had stared death in the face more times than he could count. But nothing had prepared him for this. Kalara's rage was a thing of terrifying beauty. She moved faster now, her blade blurring as she struck with a fury that could have split mountains. The air whistled with every swing, and Jack barely dodged the first before the second nearly took his head off. He countered, ducking low, driving his blade toward her stomach, but she anticipated it. Her knee slammed into his ribs, sending him reeling backward, the breath torn from his lungs. Jack gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. He needed to shift the tide. He couldn't win against her by force. She was stronger, faster, deadlier in every physical aspect. But he had something she didn't. Strategy. Kalara pressed forward, blade raised for a killing strike. Jack let her. He stood his ground, waited until the last possible second, then moved. Instead of dodging sideways like he had been doing, he lunged toward her, stepping into her blind spot just as her blade came down. He twisted his entire body, using the momentum to drive his shoulder into her leg, striking the joint where her knee met her armor. The force broke her stance. Kalara stumbled, off balance for the first time. Jack took his chance. He spun, bringing his blade up in a quick, brutal slash across her arm, cutting deep into the muscle. Not enough to cripple her, but enough to make her feel it. The crowd gasped, the tension in the arena shifting. Kalara staggered back, her breathing ragged, her golden eyes burning with something intense and wild. Jack steadied himself, gripping his knife tighter. His heart pounded in his chest. This was it. He had done what no one else had. He had made Kalara falter, and she knew it. She exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders, her chest rising and falling with exertion. She wiped the blood from her arm, watching him with something new in her gaze. Not just rage, not just frustration. Something deeper. Admiration. Jack frowned, confused by the sudden shift in her expression. Then slowly she tilted her head. "You are," she started, breathing heavy, "a worthy opponent." Jack blinked, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Does that mean you're giving up?" Kalara smirked, and then she dropped her weapons. The arena fell silent. Jack tensed. What was she doing? Kalara stepped forward, hands open, eyes locked onto his. "This fight is not about my victory," she murmured, stepping closer. "It is about yours." Jack's pulse roared in his ears. The realization hit him all at once. She was surrendering. To him. The rules of the Nihal challenge were clear. Jack Carter had won, and now Kalara belonged to him. Jack Carter stood frozen, the weight of his victory pressing down on him like an iron yoke. The roar of the crowd had faded into a distant hum in his ears, drowned out by the pounding of his own heartbeat. Kalara stood before him, unarmed, unyielding, and utterly unafraid. Her golden eyes locked onto his, unreadable in their depth, but they held no shame, no reluctance. She had given up her blades, she had given herself up. His breath came slow and steady as he took in the full gravity of the moment. This was not an act of desperation. This was a declaration. A Nihal warrior did not surrender out of weakness. She was not pleading for mercy. No, this was something else entirely. She had made a challenge. He had bested her, and now, by the unbreakable laws of her people, she was his. The realization sent a cold shiver through him. He had never fought for ownership. He had never fought for power over another. He had fought because she had left him no choice. Because refusing the challenge would have been seen as cowardice. Because the only way to walk away from this fight was to win it. But now that he had, he wasn't sure what came next. The announcer's voice boomed overhead, reverberating through the massive Colosseum. "The human has claimed victory. By the laws of the Nihal Dominion, Kalara of House Torath is now his property." A deafening cheer erupted from the crowd, shaking the very walls of the arena. Some shouted in awe, others in mockery, as if they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. A human besting a Nihal warlord? Unheard of. Impossible. And yet here they stood. Jack clenched his fists. His entire life had been spent fighting for survival, for duty, for the next mission. But never had he fought for something as insane as this. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to move, to acknowledge what had just happened. Kalara did not flinch as he stepped closer. "You sure about this?" His voice was low, measured, barely audible over the chaos of the Colosseum. Kalara smirked, a sharp, almost amused glint in her eyes. "You think I do not understand the laws of my own people?" "That's not what I meant," Jack muttered. "You don't have to do this. You could walk away." Her expression shifted, not anger, not offense, but something far more dangerous. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice smooth, unwavering. "For me to walk away?" Jack hesitated. No, that wasn't what he wanted, but he wasn't sure he could accept what this meant either. Kalara stepped closer, her presence commanding, the heat of her skin barely an inch from his. "You think this is about chains, about ownership," she murmured. "It is not." Her eyes burned into his. "This is about strength, and I have chosen to stand beside the one who bested me." Jack swallowed hard, his chest tightening at her words. This wasn't submission. This was acceptance. And something about that made it even more dangerous. The private chambers were dimly lit, the walls carved from dark stone, the air thick with the scent of burning oils and incense. The ceremonial halls beneath the Colosseum were meant for one thing only, the sealing of a warrior's oath. Jack stood at the center of the chamber, arms crossed, eyes locked onto the figure before him. Kalara. She had cleaned the blood from her wounds. her armor removed save for the ceremonial battle wraps that bound her torso, leaving her arms and shoulders bare. The deep scars of old battles marred her dark skin, each one a testament to the life she had lived, the fights she had endured. She moved with the grace of a predator, every motion deliberate, controlled, and Jack couldn't stop watching her. He had spent years fighting against the impossible, surviving on battlefields where men weren't supposed to survive. But this moment felt like the most dangerous thing he had ever faced. "You are restless," Kalara observed, her golden eyes gleaming. Jack exhaled sharply. "I'm just trying to understand all this." Kalara chuckled, low and rich, stepping toward him. "You are overthinking it, human." "Yeah? Well, excuse me for not being used to winning people in combat," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Kalara tilted her head, watching him with something almost predatory in her gaze. "You have won me," she said, voice deliberate, measured, "but not in the way you think." Jack met her eyes. "Then explain it to me." She stepped closer, slow and purposeful, until he could feel the warmth of her body near his own. "I am bound to you by the laws of my people," she said softly. "But what you fail to understand is that this is not slavery. This is not submission. It is a warrior's oath." Jack frowned. "A warrior's oath?" Kalara's smirk returned. "You bested me in combat. That means you are worthy, and in my culture, the defeated warrior does not become a servant." She leaned in, her breath warm against his skin. "They become your shadow." Jack's heart slammed against his ribs. "You're saying this is a partnership," he muttered. Kalara chuckled again. "Something like that." Jack exhaled. "So what happens now?" Kalara reached for a small ceremonial blade resting on the stone altar beside them. The weapon gleamed in the dim light, its edge razor-sharp. She met his gaze, lifting the blade between them. "You claim you're right," she said. Jack's throat tightened. "And what does that mean?" Kalara's smile was slow, knowing. "You mark me," she murmured, "and I mark you." Jack swallowed hard. "Mark?" She nodded, then dragged the edge of the blade across her palm, a thin line of dark violet blood appearing against her skin. Without breaking eye contact, she offered the blade to him. Jack hesitated for only a moment before taking it. If this was how her people did things, if this was the bond she had chosen, then he would honor it. Without a word, he cut his own palm, the sting sharp but clean. Kalara smirked. "Good," she murmured, taking his injured hand in hers, pressing their wounds together. The heat of her skin shocked him, a pulse of something ancient, primal passing between them. Jack didn't know what to say, didn't know what to feel. But as Kalara tightened her grip, her golden eyes locked onto his, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The sting of the cut on Jack's palm faded beneath the warmth of Kalara's grip, her dark violet blood mingling with his crimson. The moment their wounds pressed together, something shifted. Not just in the room, not just in the dim light of the ceremonial chamber, but in the air between them. Kalara's golden eyes burned into his, unwavering, unrelenting. This was no fleeting moment, no symbolic gesture. This was real, an ancient oath sealed in flesh and blood, binding them in a way he barely understood. Jack swallowed, feeling the weight of it settle into his chest. "You accept this bond?" she asked, her voice steady, her fingers tightening around his. He could feel the warmth of her skin, the rough calluses on her battle-worn hands, the slow pulse of her heartbeat against his palm. She had fought wars, led battles, killed and conquered, yet here she stood, offering herself to a man she had met on the sands of an arena. This was no submission. This was a warrior's choice. Jack exhaled slowly. "I do." A satisfied smirk curled at the edges of Kalara's lips. "Then, it is done." She released his hand, and Jack found himself staring at the thin line of blood where their wounds had met. The cut had already begun to clot, but the weight of what had just happened still sat heavy in his chest. He had come into this fight expecting death. Instead, he had walked away with something far more dangerous. Kalara picked up the ceremonial cloth resting on the nearby stone altar and wiped the excess blood from her palm, her movements measured, practiced. The room was still, the only sounds the distant hum of the arena above and the slow, steady rhythm of their breathing. Jack watched her, his mind still struggling to comprehend. "So," he finally said, his voice rough, "what happens now?" Kalara looked up, her golden eyes glinting in the dim light. "Now, human, she said smoothly. You learn what it means to have a Nihal warrior at your side. Jack wasn't sure if that was a threat or a promise. Maybe it was both. But before he could respond, the doors to the chamber slammed open. A towering figure entered, their armor adorned with the sigils of the Nihal High Council. Their presence alone sent a ripple of tension through the air, a silent warning that whatever was coming next would not be simple. Kalara's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. Jack straightened, already bracing himself, because if the fight in the arena had changed everything, what was coming next would change even more. The High Warlord of the Nihal Dominion stood in the doorway, his expression carved from stone. Toreth Cray was not a man to be ignored. His presence was heavy, his dark armor gleaming under the flickering torches of the chamber, his eyes sharp as obsidian. Jack knew, instinctively, that this was Kalara's bloodline, her father, or at the very least, the closest thing to it. Kalara did not bow, did not flinch, did not yield. Instead, she folded her arms across her chest and smirked. You're late. Cray's gaze flicked between her and Jack, his expression unreadable. You mean to tell me that after all these years you finally allow yourself to be claimed? His voice was deep, resonant, like the distant rumble of an oncoming storm. Kalara tilted her head. Not claimed, she corrected. Chosen. Cray exhaled sharply, as if amused. A human? His gaze settled on Jack, sizing him up in a single glance. I expected better. Jack didn't react. He'd been judged before by higher-ranking men and alien warlords alike. He had nothing to prove to this man. But he wasn't stupid enough to ignore the challenge in those words. I didn't ask for this, Jack said evenly. But I don't walk away from a fight. Cray studied him, something flickering behind his dark gaze. Not approval, not yet, but something close. That much is clear, Cray murmured, his gaze shifting back to Kalara. And you? Kalara arched a brow. I made the challenge. I knew what it meant. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then Cray sighed. You have made your choice then? Kalara's smirk returned. Was there ever a doubt? Cray gave her a long look before turning back to Jack. You may have won her in battle, human, he said, his tone unreadable, but do not mistake that for true victory. Jack met his gaze without hesitation. I don't. Cray nodded, as if that was the only answer that mattered. Then he turned, stepping back toward the entrance of the chamber. You will both leave this world soon enough, he said. But know this, human, the eyes of the Dominion are now upon you. Jack didn't doubt it for a second. The warlord left without another word, the heavy doors closing behind him. Jack exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I get the feeling that wasn't a blessing. Kalara laughed, a deep, throaty sound. No, she admitted, but it wasn't a death sentence either. Jack let out a breath. Well, I guess I'll take that. Kalara stepped closer, watching him carefully. You're still standing, she murmured, even after all this. Jack tilted his head. That surprise you? Her smirk deepened. Not at all. Another silence stretched between them, but this one felt different, charged, undeniable. Jack exhaled, shaking his head. You know, he muttered, I think I just realized something. Kalara raised a brow. Oh? He met her gaze. This isn't over, is it? Kalara grinned, golden eyes gleaming. No, human, she said, her voice rich with amusement. It's just beginning. The weight of the Nihal Dominion's eyes pressed down on Jack as he and Kalara left the ceremonial chamber. He could feel it, not just from the gathered warriors who whispered in hushed tones as they passed, but from her. From the unshaken, unreadable presence of Kalara herself. The Nihal were warriors, bred for war, raised on blood and conquest. They never surrendered. They never accepted defeat unless there was honor in it. And yet, she had chosen this fate. Chosen him. It had been a challenge, a gamble, but also something more. The moment they stepped outside, the chill of the night air bit at his skin. The twin moons of Rix Prime hung low on the horizon, casting eerie silver light over the war-torn sands beyond the city. The arena behind them still pulsed with energy, its crowds beginning to dissipate, though Jack could feel the way their gazes still followed them. Kalara walked beside him, her movements smooth, deliberate. She was too calm for someone who had just lost her claim to independence. But then again, Jack wasn't sure she saw it that way at all. They stopped near the entrance of the warriors' barracks, and she turned to him, arms crossed. You're thinking too much, she said flatly. Jack huffed, rubbing the back of his neck. I tend to do that when a woman swears herself to me in front of a few thousand screaming warriors. Clara smirked. You make it sound as though I've shackled myself to you unwillingly. Jack studied her for a moment. Haven't you? Her smirk didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. I have fought my whole life, human. I have bested foes across 100 systems, bled on 100 battlefields, and yet, none of them ever stood against me like you did. She stepped closer, her golden eyes gleaming. You think of this as a loss, but I do not lose. I have merely found something worth fighting beside instead of against. Jack exhaled, watching her carefully. He had expected resentment. He had expected defiance. Instead, he was met with something far more dangerous. Acceptance. So that's it? He murmured. You just follow me now? Clara tilted her head. No, I do not follow. We walk together. Jack wasn't sure why that hit harder than it should have. This wasn't slavery, wasn't ownership. It was a warrior's bond, and that he realized was something that meant more to her than anything else possibly could. She chose him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Jack let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Well, he muttered, if that's the case, I guess I'd better get used to having a 7-foot-tall killing machine at my side. Clara grinned, sharp and dangerous. Now you understand. And just like that, the battle that had started in the arena had become something else entirely. Something neither of them were prepared for. But something that neither of them would ever walk away from. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Jack and Clara boarded the Ironfall, his personal starship. The sleek black vessel hummed with energy, the familiar sound of its engines warming up beneath his boots. It was a ship built for war, scarred from countless battles, reinforced with stolen tech from a dozen different species. And now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't boarding it alone. Clara followed him inside, her golden eyes taking in the ship's interior with measured curiosity. He could feel her presence, the silent storm that existed in every step she took, in every calculated movement. She was watching him, testing him, still trying to understand who he was now that the fight was over. Jack moved toward the control panel, flicking a few switches, feeling the ship shudder to life beneath him. You ever been on a human warship before? Clara ran a hand along the metal framework, her fingers tracing the scars from previous battles. No, but I have destroyed them. Jack huffed a quiet laugh. Yeah, sounds about right. She turned, her gaze locking onto his. And now? Jack exhaled, leaning against the control panel. Now, you're on one, not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, but as he hesitated, searching for the right word. Clara watched him expectantly. Then, before he could say it, she finished for him. As a partner. Jack stilled, because she was right, because that's what this had become. Not ownership, not subjugation, a choice, a bond, a warrior's oath. Slowly he nodded. Yeah, he murmured, something like that. Clara's smirk returned, but this time there was something different in her gaze, something unchanging, unbreakable. A silent promise that this was only the beginning. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her, close enough that she could have snapped his neck in an instant if she wanted to. Instead, she reached forward, gripping his forearm in the ancient Nihal warrior's clasp, a gesture not of servitude, but of absolute loyalty. You do not yet understand what it means to have a Nihal warrior beside you, she murmured, voice low. But you will. Jack looked down at their hands, then back up at her. And for the first time since that fight in the arena, he believed her. The Ironfall's engines rumbled to full power, the ship lifting from the surface, breaking through the planet's atmosphere with a force that shook the hull. As the world below them disappeared into the void, Jack knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs. And whatever came next, they would face it together.